Dr. Narasimhan. Ladies and gentlemen, let me start by admitting how overwhelmed I feel seeing my inadequacy with respect to a subject which has engaged huge minds over the centuries. I'm neither a philosopher, nor a historian, nor a student of religion, within whose domain the topic would normally fall. If I venture to speak today, it's only because there is this psychological angle which might not have been sufficiently explored or with which the audience might not have been fully familiar. Even within this narrow focus, there is so much to say, so much has been written about, so many linkages to be established that I would request you to withhold your questions and comments till I've stopped. I want to go in one train of thought. I'm also aware that the subject itself, and perhaps my treatment of it, might arouse passions. Subject of God usually does. And therefore request all those whom I make angry to hold their horses, tomatoes, rotten eggs, and other missiles till after I have spoken. As far as the ideas go, the idea of God is perhaps one of the oldest, if not the oldest, to have caught the imagination of humanity. When I say God, I refer also to spirituality in all its manifestations. So powerful has been this hold on the minds of people that in spite of millennia having passed, it has continued to occupy a paramount place in our lives. The idea has inspired the highest in form of human endeavor, poetry, sculpture, architecture, philosophy, as well as the lowest, wars, domination, slavery, and all forms of aggression. And as you know, it continues to do both to the present day. At the end of the 19th century, there was this opinion that with continued advancement of science, the idea would perhaps weaken. The idea of God would perhaps weaken. Nietzsche, amongst others, had announced the death of God. But as some of you might be familiar with, he was challenged by the following graffiti, which was put against him. Can you put the first slide, please? So Nietzsche said God is dead, and God said Nietzsche is dead. And that's it. Thank you. Put the light off. Freud, the famous psychiatrist, believed that God was an illusion created by the human mind to invoke a father figure who would hold our hands as we face nature's capriciousness. He hoped that through education, and he called it education to reality, man would become mature enough to forego this idea in course of time. That too has not happened. Nothing of the sort has happened. Materialist philosophies denying the existence of God have appeared in all cultures and civilizations. For example, the Lokayatas in our ancient India and communism in the modern world, but they have disappeared, leaving behind tiny groups of adherents. A Gallup poll conducted amongst adult Americans and published in January 1996 issue of the Wall Street Journal showed that 96% of the people believed in God, 90% believed in heaven, 79% in miracles, and 73% in hell. This as late as 1996. A study conducted by Nature magazine in 1997 amongst a random sample of 1,000 Americans from the latest edition of the American Men and Women in Science revealed that 40% of the scientists believed in personal God. Mathematicians came up top believers, as with a figure of 45%. I have not been able to lay my hand on any similarly carried survey in India, but in a study on scientific creativity conducted by me, along with my student Dr. Susmita Subramaniam, We asked questions about belief in God and spirituality also. The sample was indeed very small, only 20, but for whatever it is worth, I'll tell you that 10 out of the 20 senior scientists from the IISc, Institute of Science, believed in God, or at least a superior force which directs the happening in the world. The word is directs. When people are asked why they believe in God, the most common answer is that there seems to be a design in the universe. Design in the universe and a design in the life on this universe. And if there's a design, there must be a designer. Universe is governed by laws, so there must be a lawgiver. The body parts of a living being are so perfectly attuned to function they perform that they must have been created by a superior intelligence. Reputed scientists themselves have added to the drama when they make statements which are taken as supportive proofs by the ID community. By ID community, I mean those who believe in the intelligent designer. Let me show you the next slide. This is from Freeman Dyson. As we look out in the universe and identify many accidents of physics and astronomy that have worked out to our benefit, it almost seems as if the universe must in some way, in some sense, have known that we were coming. He said that in 1979. Next, please. Stephen Hawking. He said, why is the universe so close to the dividing line between collapsing again and expanding indefinitely? In order to be as close as we are now, the rate of expansion early on had to be chosen fantastically accurately. If the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been less by 1 part in 10 to the power 10, the universe would have collapsed after a few million years. If it had been greater by 1 part in 10 to the power 10, the universe would have been essentially empty after a few million years. In either case, would it have lasted long enough for life to develop? Thus, one either has to appeal to the anthropic principle or find some physical explanation of why the universe is the way it is. Anthropic principle. This is the term used. What does that term signify? It signifies that universe is adapted to man. Let me paraphrase something said by another physicist, Frank Tipler, who is a member of the anthropic community. According to him, the intelligent life which has come upon the earth has already learned about some laws of universe, and as a result can control some phenomena of the universe. It will keep growing more and more, learning more and more, and able to control more and more, till it knows and can control everything there is to know and control. This, according to him, is the omega point, the all-knowing and all-powerful being. This being will then have the power to resurrect all that was there before. By implication, this powerful being will then start the universe all over again. I wonder why he hesitates to call this being God. Now, the argument for design is also mounted by biologists who cannot fathom how evolution could have produced such wonderful life forms through the blind process of natural selection. They talk of irreducible complexity in life forms, by which they mean a compound of several matched interacting parts, all of which contribute to the basic function. According to them, any removal or change in any one part will cause the system to effectively shut down. The common example the biologists of this group give is that of the human eye. Everything in eye is so perfectly matched to facilitate vision. How could natural selection create the human eye when none of the individual parts has any adaptive significance? They ask. Now, all these arguments have, of course, been challenged by the non-believers in the anthropic principle. If we can think of uncountable atoms, uncountable planets, uncountable stars, why not think of uncountable universes, one of which might just have the necessary precondition for life? Or why not use Hawking's own model of the universe, in which the time and space have a closed surface, form a closed surface with no beginning and no end? Universe that never started. It always was and is. The irreducible complexity of life form, this argument has also been challenged. Now, in case of human eye, there's a well-described evolutionary path from the eye spot to the deep recessed eye spot to the pinhole camera to the lens eye and finally the complex human eye. And who says that human eye is so well designed? The light-sensitive cells sit behind the amacrine cells, which sit behind the ganglion cells, which sit behind the blood vessels. Any designer with any sense would have put the light-sensitive cells right behind the lens, they claim. Stephen Jay Gould further weakens the anthropic principle by invoking the historical laws of contingency. According to him, evolution occurs through an unpredictable sequence of antecedent states, where any major change in any step or sequence would alter the final result. And as his famous statement goes, if the tape of life is wound back and replayed, there's very little chance of human beings as we know them having ever been evolved. Now, these arguments are going back and forth between those who believe in anthropic principles and those who don't. But in my opinion, the mistake the new cosmologists and the new creationists, as well as those who oppose them, the mistake they're making is in seeking scientific support for something which is a matter of belief and faith. Science is a process of inquiry aimed at building testable body of knowledge, constantly open to rejection and confirmation. Religion and faith are sets of belief which provide meaning to life, whose truths are final and confirmed by faith. The question we should really be asking goes like this: what are the mechanisms which install and sustain belief systems in absence of corroborating facts? Why do we believe when there is no corroborating fact to that? To understand these mechanisms and their relationship to God and religion, we need to take cues from another science, and that's the science of psychology, as well as the new developments which have occurred in our understanding of the brain function. From these disciplines, I shall now selectively pick out such features which are relevant to our discussion today. Now, I'm picking out from an ordered body of knowledge, but something which reflects on what we're discussing today, because we don't have time to examine the whole train of thought. The brain makes sense of the environment through certain collective functions which have been called cognitive operators. These cognitive operators are the following. First of all, the holistic operator. This allows the world to be seen as a whole. Secondly, reductionist operator. This is the antithesis of the holistic operator and enables the mind to see the whole broken into its component parts. Thirdly, abstractive operator helps in arriving at general concepts from perception of individual facts. Quantitative operator, which permits abstraction of quantity from perception of various elements. Next. The causal operator. This helps to interpret all reality as a sequence of specific causes and effects. This is the basis of how and why questions. Any event, how did it happen? What happened before? Okay, what happened before that? And what happened before that? And what happened before that? This causal operator makes the mind go on and on in that direction. Then there's the binary operator. It helps the mind to make sense of things by reducing the most complicated relations of, say, space and time to simple pairs of opposites, up versus down, left versus right, before versus after, and so on. Then the existential operator This operator assigns a sense of reality to the sensory information processed by the brain. This tells us what is possible and what is not possible. Am I seeing what is really there, or am I seeing what is not there? Then finally, the emotional value operator. This provides emotional value to the element of perception and cognition. Is it good? It's bad. Do I want to see it? Do I don't want to see it? Do I want to go through the experience? Do I not want to go through the experience? And so on. Now, all these cognitive operators have survival value. Think of them. Even without one of them, you can't even move from one point to the other. You have to know up and down, for example. If you close your eyes and start to think in such a way where the operators don't work, you will find that you cannot do it because you are forced to make sense of the experience you have. There's a kind of a biological push to make sense of what is going on in front of you. Think of a hunter in the old times, in the pre-civilization times. A hunter in the midst of a forest. As he's moving towards his target, let's think a deer, he hears a sound behind him. What is it? Is it a footstep? Is it the deer? Is it a tiger? He looks back, but there is no tiger. His memories of times when he saw a tiger jump up in his mind. There's a mental scanning of the various possibilities. As the cognitive operators are helping me analyze the situation, the emotional evaluator is giving negative signals till a moment comes when the hunter runs away, even when he has not seen the tiger. The hunter does not know, does not have to know whether there was a real tiger lurking behind or not. It was enough that he believed it. Believing has survival value. Cognitive imperatives force a belief in absence of knowledge. This is just a small example, small illustration to tell you how beliefs are formed. But there are larger questions in human life than the presence or absence of a tiger. What is death? Very early in the evolution, man must have come across death and asked this question. What is this death? What happens after death? Where did I come from? Where will I go? Who made this universe? Now, these are metaphysical questions which the cognitive operators, especially the causal operator, force on us, asking why, what, how. Material environment fails to provide answers. Cognitive operators must find answers, otherwise tension builds up. Otherwise, you feel uncomfortable. The answers come from conjectures. Conjectures become beliefs. Beliefs coalesce to form belief systems. Belief systems are elaborated by our storytelling propensity to become myths. There's a great misunderstanding about myths. People in the ordinary language think myth means false. That's now not the origin of the word myth. Myth comes from the Greek background, which the root word is mythos, which means final pronouncement, as against logos, which means a word whose veracity can be disputed. Myth is the word whose veracity cannot be disputed. It's a pronouncement. Now, myths are powerful things. The power coming from their emotional charge. And the emotions are of three kinds. Firstly, there is the emotion of satisfaction and joy at having found the answers. These questions about why and how, where did I come from, where am I going, keep bothering us, and our belief systems give you the answer. So you're comfortable. I found the answer. Secondly, there's the emotion of awe. Awe at the sheer daring of the imagination which produced the answers. If you think of the myths, the language used, the daring used, the imagination used is such that it gives you a sense of awe. And thirdly, there is the emotion of inspiration, produced by the metaphorical language in which the myths are pronounced. If we read the myth about the myths, myths of origin, for example, across the cultures, you'll find such wonderful language in which they are given that it inspires you in a poetic mood. Myths, when shared by a community, become religions. When same myth is accepted by a group of people, it becomes a religion. Now, myths are a part of human legacy. The fact that Neanderthal graves show the presence of tools, clothing, essential supplies, along with the skeletal remains, demonstrates that even at that earlier stage in its evolution, man had some myth to explain what happens after death. That's why the things were being kept next to the body. In course of time, the religions proceed beyond their mythical onset and develop logical systems, vocabularies, philosophies, rules, and customs. Now, these are very necessary for the social intercourse, but none of these provides sustenance to religions. Once the allegorical power of Abraham talking to God, Christ dying for humanity, Gabriel ordering Mahmud to recite the surahs, Tatsum Asi, or the stories of Dashavatas is lost. Once that allegory is lost, the religions die, only to give place to others which answer the existential questions in a more attractive emotional package. I have till now described one route to religion, but there is another equally important route. This is the route of mystical experience. A mystical experience may be defined as an intuition of the person's numerical oneness with a larger consciousness, which may be called God by one, Brahman by others, Shunyata by third, and so on. The important thing is that it is an experience which cannot be described in terms of something familiar to our ordinary consciousness. People who have gone through this experience have tried to talk about it. There are so much literature about these experiences. They've tried to talk about it, and the wonderful thing is that whatever the description, from whichever culture it comes, there is almost a monotonous similarity in what comes out of these descriptions. I felt one with the whole universe. I lost sense of myself. I lost my own will. I was in hands of superior power. There was no time and space. I was in ecstasy. I would love to have this experience again. People see visions. Visions are, of course, colored by their cultural background, but visions are seen. To most people, the realities of this consciousness is more real than what experience they have had in ordinary consciousness. I'll just give a personal example. When I was doing my research on yoga, I was practicing meditation quite a lot. And one day I sat down in the Pondicherry ashram, Arvindra ashram, and there were friends with me, and I closed my eyes, and when I opened my eyes, a friend said, "Thank God you've come out of it." I said, "What happened?" He said, "You were lost." I said, "How long?" 3 hours. Now, I remember that particular incident more clearly than most incidents in life, because I do remember seeing things in that particular phase. I could see some particular kind of light. I had a joyful feeling, I had a feeling of lightness. That feeling has still not disappeared. In small doses, all of us have had mystical experiences. Watching a beautiful sunrise, looking at the face of a child, seeing a beautiful painting, listening to music, and sexual intercourse with a lover all provide this mystical experience, at least in some degree. The gurus tell us that everybody can have this experience, this oneness during meditation. This, and the fact that all these descriptions of the state are roughly similar, makes one suspect that there may be a neurophysiological basis to this particular kind of consciousness because of the commonality, because of the same words, cross cultures. As some of you know, the neurosurgeon Ramchandran, who's in San Diego neurological department. He has shown that the temporal lobe might be important to such an experience. When religious cues were given to people who were otherwise religious, they found activity in the temporal lobe region. There have been researches done to show that the attention changes occur, and hence the frontal lobe area is also involved. More recently, a group of neurologists have taken pictures of brains in the meditative stage using single photon emission computer tomography, SPECT. Can I show you the next slide, please? Have a look at this slide. Look at the left side only. There is this area in the back called OAA. This is the orientation association area in the left superior parietal gyrus, in that area. There's a right one also, but we are at the moment concentrating with the OAA, which is on the left side. And they find what this area does is, it is responsible for giving us our body image in the space. If we don't have this body image, we can't even walk about. We'll get lost. People who have damaged this area can't move. The right side gives you the sense of space around, and the left side gives you the sense of your body image in that space. Now, these people have found that during meditation, the activity in this OAA gets greatly diminished, which means that this area is working less efficiently. There's a deafferentation of this area, and it shows that person's body image is lost. And from there, you can find some kind of physiological relationship to sense of loss of sense of self when you are in meditation. Put it off. There have been other experiments to show that there are brain changes during various kinds of meditation. Now, whatever the neurology correlates, there is no denying that human beings have mystical experiences and are capable of mystical experiences. What is the survival value of this? I mentioned earlier the survival value of the myths, but what kind of survival value would the mystical experience have? What purpose does it serve? Now, scientists have not been able to answer this question yet. But let me try, in my own small way, to think what this survival value of this function could be. I think the survival value lies in the fact that it gives a sense of comfort with knowing that our self is not limited to this mortal body, that I'm part of something bigger which has no beginning or end in space and time, and maybe that means I'll survive after I'm dead. You may ask me a mischievous question which I've asked myself. Supposing there was really a reality larger, truer than the reality of ordinary consciousness, how would one know the difference from an experience of this larger reality from that produced by the play of neurons? That if you stimulate the neurons, you produce the same thing, and if you see the larger reality, how do you differentiate the two? This is actually not a simple question, it's a deep philosophical question. The question has been asked by philosophers for a long time. How do I know that what seems real to me is really real? Because for these people who are going through meditative experiences, this is very real, more real than the reality we know. How do we agree to the common reality which we see in every day? I think the agreement comes by consensus of some kind. And there is quite a lot of consensus amongst the people who practice meditation also. When they talk about the experiences, they talk very similarly, and they agree, yeah, you felt that, I felt that too. So, the reality of this reality does not disappear by using the concept of consensus. Well, there's a third psychological issue which we must consider. I've mentioned two. Myth is important, mythical thinking is important, altered consciousness is important. The third psychological issue is that life is difficult and frightening. It would be wonderful if there was a father or mother figure, as Freud said, who will take us into arms and make these difficulties disappear and these fears go away. This need gives rise to beliefs about a caring and loving higher being, and we tend to return their love with our love. Or alternately, we love this being to get its love. We bargain with this higher entity in having a loving relationship. We establish the relationship, and these relationships start very young in our age. Our parents encourage us to do that. Worship. It is my thesis that the idea of God, in all its variations, is a result of an interplay between all these three psychological factors. Capacity to make myths, capacity to experience altered states of consciousness, and the capacity to love and be loved. If we look through the history of religions, we find that all these three have played their part, with one or the other player having a more prominent role. Not being a historian of religion, I'm unable to take you to the respective trajectories of the various faiths and creeds. But even from my rather limited understanding, I find that man over the centuries has mixed these three ingredients to conceive of every form of God that the brain is capable of conceiving. Further, though one religion has taken one or the other road, it has also tested conceptual bylanes which connect to the roads which other religions have taken as the main road. What I'm trying to say is that it is naive to believe that my religion has a special conception of God which other religions don't have or are not able to think of. I would like to say that over the millennia, people have been thinking about the subject. Everybody has thought of all possible ways you can have of thinking about God. And I would very much like to take this moment to put my case against this synopry of religions, that mine is better than the other one. We keep hearing that. Let's quickly go through what I understand about the story of religions. All religions in the early phases start by positing spirits to represent the awe-inspiring elements and phenomena of nature. Well described, well talked. Shamanistic religions do that even today. All the religions in the earlier phases have a history of appeasing these spiritual sacrifices, animal sacrifices, human sacrifices. Very simple thing. How do you make happy a person who might be angry with you? Feed him. So feeding these gods through sacrifices is the method used. As the civilizations grow, these spirits also grow along with it. They acquire character, they acquire personality, they acquire life stories. These spirits become minor gods. Indra, Varuna in Hindu mythology, Apsu, Marduk, Tiamat, Baal in the Middle Eastern mythology. These minor gods have reigned over the minds of the people for long, long times. They have human characteristics. They can be capricious, they can be sly, they can be angry, they can be friendly, depending on how the humans relate to them. Think of our Puranic stories, and you will find all kinds of relationships these gods have had with us. Once the friendship is inculcated, is developed, they can go in and out of the houses of the rishis, soothsayers and godmen, offering them advice or scolding them, as the case may be. If you go through the literature again, the mythological literature, you find God coming, or God came to me and said, don't do this or do this. It's like a visitor coming to you and talking to you. I found it very fascinating that when I was reading about Sumerian mythology, apparently architects used to come from heaven to build the cities and palaces of Sumerians. And I remember Vishwakarma coming and building the palaces of the human beings, the epic heroes. Now, as the civilizations grow further, these gods do not seem satisfactory anymore. Human mind has become more complex, so he wants more complex understanding. The existential questions, where did I come from? What am I doing here? Where am I going? Become more important, and then many get the courage to openly ask these questions. In some civilizations, our civilization, the Aryan civilization, these questions were boldly asked. I propose, I don't know what really happened, I propose that the living conditions in our area were comfortable enough for people to have time enough to ask these questions, which was not possible for people living in Europe or Middle East, which is a desert area. So we asked these questions boldly. And the one hymn which I'm sure everybody is familiar with, from the creation hymn from Rig Veda, puts this existential doubts most poignantly. Can you have the next slide, please? I have paraphrased this creation hymn. It is much longer than that. There was neither existence nor non-existence, neither death nor immortality then. What stirred? Who really knows? Gods came afterwards. I think it's a very fascinating concept that gods came after this. Who knows whence this universe has arisen? Perhaps it formed itself. Perhaps it did not. The one who looks down upon it from the highest heaven, only he knows. Or perhaps even he does not. Now, I think it's a very, very bold relationship with the creation. Big questions deserve big answers. A most magnificent answer came in our own civilization in the form of the concept of Brahman. All is one. Everything came from Brahman. Please put it off. Atma and Brahman are one. That is, I am part of this totality. Brahman defies description. It cannot be the subject of any adjectives, neti neti. Very, very briefly, I have defined how Brahman has been conceived. But please do not think that we Hindus have a copyright over Brahman. It has appeared in other religions also. We all have heard of the unmoved mover of Greeks. Let me quote from some other religions. Here is a quote from a seer of the early Christianity. He said this: "The ultimate reality is primal unity. All things owe their existence to this reality. Because this is simplicity itself, there's nothing to say about it. It has no qualities distinct from its essence. We cannot even say it exists, since as being itself, it is not a thing, but is distinct from all things." Is there any difference from what we have said in our? No difference at all. Or from the Sufis of Islam: "I am he whom I love, and he whom I love is I. We are two spirits in one body. If thou seest me, thou seest him. And if thou seest him, thou seest us both." Or from the Jews: "They shouldn't be left behind. Everything in thee, and thou art in everything. Thou wert in everything before everything was created." Why this similarity? Mind is able to think of this, and mind is the same as everywhere. And I wanted to make this point because so often we Hindus, and I'm a proud Hindu, we tend to say, look, nobody has thought of the reality as we have thought of to be. Everybody has thought of it. They have taken other routes for other reasons. This is a grand vision. This undescribable oneness, and which includes my soul also. But there is a little problem with this. The little problem with this vision is the problem of explaining how something which has no qualities can create things which have qualities. The universe. It's a happening thing, this universe. How can something which has nothing happening in it create something which is happening in it? Our Hindu philosophy has employed a variety of strategies, and if you don't mind, I like to call them tricks, to deal with this dilemma. I have no time to go through this, but I would suggest to you that if you read Advaita, you read Vishishta Advaita, or read Dvaita, you will find very different, interesting explanations of how this reality, which has no characteristics, produces a reality which has characteristics. All of them have given their own different ways of describing it. So what is the next step in this vision then? We have already reached a vision of great reality. What's the next step? The next step is to say that since it has no qualities, it cannot be talked about. On this issue, I am mum, said Buddha, next man in this chain of events. He said, don't ask me these questions. Because he and other of people before him had gone through this question which I'm asking you today, that how can a reality which has no characteristics create reality which has characteristics? So he had gone through that and he said, don't ask me this. This is not my interest. He said, if you want answers, go through the experience. Meditate. He described different types of meditation from which you can grasp the reality as it really is, according to him. But he did something even better. He exhorted us to live in this world without going to extremes and gave us some very interesting and nice ways of living with each other. Again, today we don't have time to go through this. Now, all this philosophizing is marvelous, but it doesn't touch my heart. Brahman is marvelous. My heart doesn't respond to it. I need something to which my heart responds, to which my emotions respond. I need gods who protect me, let me love them, have characteristics I can empathize with from my human stance. Shiva, Vishnu, Brahma. These three then constantly trying to supersede each other. If you go through our religious history, you will find evidence that there have been fights about who's superior. Brahma lost quite early in this battle. But the Shaivites and the Vaishnavites are still arguing who is superior. Basically, this is given to us by our own mind, something we can love, something we can relate to. Even Buddha, soon after his death, was given godhood by the later Buddhists. Images were made, displayed, worshipped, and all that. We need that. We can't live without that. We need love, we need to love this bigger reality which supports us. In one particular culture, it just so happened that one of the gods, amongst many which were there, took battle against the other gods. The history shows, I'm not talking of actual fights, I'm talking of the historical reports of the stories of the myths, which tell you about the fights of Yahweh with other gods in the Middle East. And he saw that he won. And then he instructed the Jews. He took a pledge from Abraham and Moses that they will not put any other god before him. If they agree, he'll protect them. Otherwise, he'll bring his wrath upon them. And Jewish history is replete with incidents when Yahweh got angry, brought storms, fires, rains of stones, and so on. But interesting that out of all the possible gods, one remained. This became a monotheistic religion. Slowly, finding that he was now being properly obeyed, he changed his character also. This wrathful God of the Jews became slowly more compassionate. He gave a series of instructions on how to live life through Torah, the Jewish Torah, and then he became more distant. Okay, you do this, and I won't interfere too much in your life. Till that time, he was interfering. So he went away. There came another variation of the theme then. God incarnated itself in form of a human being, Christ, in the Western culture. The Christian philosophy is still engaged in this battle. Is Christ God? Is he Son of God? Is he emanation of God, or is he a human being? These discussions are still going on. And interestingly, there are different sects in Christianity which would support one or the other of these possibilities. But we Hindus have beaten Christians in this game. How? We have had avatars. Not one incarnation, many incarnations. Vishnu coming down in human form to solve problems of humanity and then going away. We have no problem with God becoming human. We haven't philosophized about the question of whether Krishna was God or not God. For us, he is God. Nobody has ever asked the question. It's very interesting. This kind of philosophical inquiry is not part of our tradition. This is because we have a secret formula which we use when these arguments and counter-arguments become uncomfortable. What is that? It's all Maya anyway. It's all Leela. So the discussion stops. I think that's why the Hindus have not proceeded on this very obvious inquiry. How can you, when somebody who is such powerful entity, how can you put in form of human being? I think the moment has come now to end my talk. But before I do that, I must respond to what Professor Srikantan asked me the other day to do today. He told me, you must say something about your own conception of God. So I shall do that. I'm afraid I'm not religious. Part of it might have been obvious in what I'm saying, but I'm not religious. Eysenck, a very famous British psychologist, once said, I'm sure there must be a gene for religiosity, and I'm sorry I don't have it. I feel the same. My wife will tell you. I do not find it difficult to say, I don't know. Oh, the existential questions bother me as much as they bother anyone, perhaps more. I've spent last 20 years chasing sannyasis, as you know, trying to understand their utterly inalienable belief in God. I admire them for their belief. I marvel at their confidence when they say, I live in the forest. I said, what about your food? Food will come, God will provide me. And they mean it. And they do it. I can't do it. My ability to say, I don't know, in fact, is not any inferior ability. I don't feel inferior to these great sannyasis. I admire them, but I don't personally feel any inferior either. This ability to say, I don't know, gives me freedom. Freedom to think for myself, freedom to take responsibility for my actions. The universe takes a whole new meaning when you know that your place in it was not preordained. It was not designed for us. It was indeed not designed at all. And I'll quote an author whom I have read with great pleasure. This is Michael Shermer, whose book I read, How We Believe. He says, to share in the sublimity of knowledge generated by other human minds, and perhaps even to make a tiny contribution towards that body of knowledge, which will be passed on down the ages, part of a cumulative wisdom of single species on a tiny planet orbiting an ordinary star on the remote edge of not so unusual galaxy, itself a member of cluster of galaxies, billions of light years from nowhere, this is sublime in itself. I share that feeling. Now, I must tell you that lots of time I feel this. Most of the time I feel this. But not all the time I feel this. Must admit that. For example, and I'll share a secret with you, just before we got together, I said a little prayer, let my lecture go well. I hope it has. Thank you.
We will have questions now. And I don't know how Professor Kapoor would like to do that. We will start with individual.
Like Vishnu coming and talking to people, like God himself coming and talking to people, to man, in a one-to-one relation. When we try to explain this, you said that people haven't really asked that question because anyway it's Maya, like just what you said. Like, did God really come in, and is he really God? And
can you hear me? What I was saying was this, that in the Christian community, in the Western community, when incarnation came in form of Christ, a lot of philosophical debate went on. How could this man have can be called a God because he's a human being? I said that when, in our case, when we talk of Krishna or Rama or all these gods, we have no problem with accepting that these are avatars of Vishnu, that Vishnu has come in this form. So that's the point. We don't have those kind of philosophical inquiries.
I agree. That's fine, but I was just wondering, I want to say this point about resurrection. This concept of Christ and actually being God and coming into humanity, it rubs in with the reality. There are some evidences, as quoted by many philosophical thinkers in Christianity line. They have proofs and they have evidences which say about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's not just God coming in the world, into the world and going back. There's something which is a new concept which I think hasn't been touched. It's about the resurrection of Christ, and
right.
Actually he coming back to life from death. And that, I think, something which you haven't touched upon. What do you say about this? And
I agree with you. I have not touched upon that. Like I've not touched upon many things. But it's a very interesting thing. I don't think this is so familiar in other cultures. If I read more, maybe it will be there also. Any other?
Yes.
So regarding Ramayana, Mahabharata, or Bhagavad Gita, was there, or it's a man-made cooked story long back?
I don't know.
What is your comment on that?
I don't know. The point is that this myth is wonderful. Perhaps it has got a historical background also. But to me, it doesn't matter whether it was there or not. The value is in the myth, the message that myth gives. That's another form of reality.
Thanks for the talk. It was interesting. The talk apparently was about the history of the idea of God, but I don't know if this was deliberate, but you seem to have left out the latest view of God among certain segments of humanity, namely that who encourages young men and women to become suicide bombers.
I think it's a very important question. I haven't touched it because one can't touch about everything in a 1-hour lecture. But I wanted to tell you something. Sense of right and wrong, morality. If we give sociological reasons for that, that doesn't seem to make such an influence on people as irrational reasons. For example, God. Now, in some way or the other, brainwashing has been going on in all of us from the beginning. These young people, some of whom I've been working in this area of militancy, are much more charged by the emotion of this concept that I will reach paradise after I die. For them, that is real, true reality. Dying is not as important because I'm going to get somewhere better. So, in religious grounds, I understand it.
Mentioned that in Aurobindo Ashram, you had an experience. Can you tell us whether that experience had any effect on your thinking, on you as a quality of human being?
All experiences in my life have had effect on my further behavior. Let's first accept that. And not just my life, your life too. We grow on experiences. Yes. Personally, yes. There were things I could do after that which I was not so able to do before. The sense of continuity, sense of with other human beings made me, I think, respect and show affection to others much more than I was able to. I became a little less selfish, I think. Little less, because it's a hard struggle to go on. But there were other changes.